Okay, next in this series of Haggadah, say what? We're going to question the next thing in the Haggadah, the next big thing, which is Lachma, Anya. The child has already asked the questions, why are we eating matzah? And theoretically, as an answer to the child's question, the leader of the Seder points to the matzah sitting on the table and says, this poor bread is the bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt, which is very confusing. I mean, we always let things slide, but Jews, if you learned any Gemara or any question, well, let's put it this way, if you learned anything about Yiddishkeit, you know, as we just found out, that Jews are supposed to ask questions. We just had the 4 questions, and now we're already starting with something which begs a question. You point at the matzah and you say, this poor bread is the bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt. What? We all know that later on in the Seder, we'll be making a bracha, a blessing on the matzah. And we'll be talking about the fact, Ki gorshu miMitzrayim, because they ran out of Egypt. And as we all know, the story, they didn't have time when they were running out of Egypt, getting out of Dodge, escaping to their freedom. They didn't have time for the bread to rise, so they left with matzah. And we eat matzah to commemorate that. So what's this story about this matzah being the poor bread that our ancestors ate as slaves in Egypt? Theoretically, the matzah really only came into play at the end, when they were leaving Egypt, running to freedom. Not only that, but in the Torah, when the Jews who had already left Egypt are fearing that there's nothing to eat in the desert, they say, oh my goodness, couldn't we have stayed in Egypt where we ate well? Oh, there's lots of food in Egypt. What are we doing here in the desert? So that also seems to contradict, the Torah seems to contradict this statement that this poor bread is the bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt. So, because there seems to be a surface inaccuracy here, we might want to delve a little deeper into what the meaning of this poor bread is. I believe that it's a matter of you are what you eat. That is to say, this poor bread is not necessarily the bread that we ate in Egypt when, according to the Torah, what we said was we were dining well, eating well in Egypt. It's actually a symbolic depiction of the state of our ancestors at the time when we were slaves. A couple hundred years of slavery had to do something to you. And herein we have the real dynamic of the Seder, because the matzah actually serves 2 purposes. We're saying here that it's poor bread and it's terrible and it's depressing. But later on, we're saying, oh, the matzah is the bread of freedom. It's liberation. It's the sign that we were running away from slavery, going into Egypt. It's a triumphant symbol. And therein lies one of the great underlying dynamics of the Seder. It is not a static thing. It's not something that stays on the same level. In fact, what we do when we read the Haggadah is we trace the rise of the Jewish people from degradation, subjugation, oppression, and slavery to the birth of a nation, freedom, triumph. And the matzah acts as the bellwether for this rise. Actually, it's called often an arc The Seder forms an arc, a curve. We start out as subjugated slaves. We end up as a newborn nation of free people, serving God and not the Egyptian gods, and not subject to slavery in Egypt anymore. So the matzah transforms from one to the other during the Seder. At the beginning, it's a depiction of our lowly estate. The matzah is flat. The matzah is beaten down. The matzah, by halakha, by the Jewish law, what we eat, is not allowed to rise. And that was the state of the Jewish people. And we have to understand how dire the situation was, because Jews, as a rule, are not complacent victims. Victimology is not really the Jewish style. We have, when the Romans were, when the Romans were besieging us, we have many stories of valor on the part of the besieged Jews in Jerusalem coming out to do battle with the Romans, and a few Jews killing multitudes of Romans. And we have Bar Kokhba, a man of great strength and power, who led the revolt against the Romans. And we have, of course, the Maccabees, who rebelled against the oppression of the Greeks and triumphed. And we have, of course, the fact that the Haggadah reminds us that we come from Abraham, and that Abraham's deal with God was the reason we were liberated from slavery, because of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And Abraham was a rebel exemplary. Everyone in the world worshipped idols. Everyone. Except for one man who stood against the entire world. And that, of course, was Abraham. And because Abraham, and the Haggadah mentions this, of course, that from the beginning, and we'll get to this maybe a little later, maybe not, you're going to run into it when you read through your Haggadah. From the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. And that's a very important point that the Haggadah makes. And we read it every Pesach. What does it mean? What does it mean? It means, why are we the chosen people? We come from idol worshippers. Are we the chosen people because we're all really good looking, like myself, or valorous, like me, and brilliant, the way I am? Are we all as clever, brilliant, and as good looking as I am? Is that why we were the chosen people? Because of our good looks, because of our intelligence, because of all the good midos we have? No! We were not rescued. God did not step in to save us from slavery and liberate us and make us into a nation because we were so wonderful. He saved us to keep the promise that he made to our rebel founder of monotheism, Abraham. The covenant God made with Abraham is the reason God came to free us from slavery, to keep his promise to Abraham. God promised to Abraham that the Jews would be, his descendants would be slaves, and he promised him that he would come and take them out. So Abraham is the whole reason this happened. And because he was a rebel exemplar. He was the greatest rebel who ever lived. He was also a great military general. So why am I bringing all this up? To show you how far the Jews had fallen and how desperately terrible their estate had become. The matzah is what represents the Jews after 200 years of slavery. It's flat. It can't rise. It is beaten down. And that is what happened. Because you would ask the question, if the Jews have this in their blood, the gene for revolting against oppression, has demonstrated time and time again in our history. The Warsaw Ghetto, there's a million. The Warsaw Uprising, there's a million. I mean, even you could even say Marxism, the rights of the worker, because Jews have this gene in their DNA to revolt against oppression generally oppression of workers. You'd have to ask the question, why didn't they revolt? They were in a terrible situation in Egypt. They were subjugated, they were oppressed, and they were made to worship Egyptian gods. They were brainwashed, they were intimidated. Why didn't they revolt? And that's the point Lachma Anya is making. We weren't ourselves. We were so beaten down, so flat, that this poor bread represented our sad estate in existentially. This is the way we started out when God came to rescue us from slavery. And we had fallen very, very far. Many of us, perhaps the majority, had adopted Egyptian gods and Egyptian practices and had fallen to what is called the 49th level of Tuma. That's a story for another episode, I guess. But we were in danger. We were so far sunken, so low, that we were in danger of being spiritually annihilated because of the low level that we had sunk to spiritually. So that's what Lachma Anya is supposed to represent. It represents not that we ate it necessarily, because like I say, according to the Torah, we say, well, we ate well in Egypt as slaves. But it represents our beings existentially as being low, flat, unable to rise, so unable to rise that we weren't able to be ourselves like a Jew is and ask questions and rebel against the situation and make an uprising. We couldn't even do that. We could not be ourselves. That's how far gone we were, and that is the point of Lachma Anya. And later on, we'll see that as we rise from this sad estate, the matzah transforms from a symbol of our lowly estate to one of liberation, freedom, and exaltation, and that's the ark that exists in the Seder, that the bread may not be able to rise, but we do triumphantly.